I Survived the Great Alaska Earthquake, 1964, by Lauren Tarshis. Chapter 1. Friday, March 27th, 1964, 5:36 p.m., Valdez, Alaska. To 11-year-old Jackson Barrett, it seemed like the world was ending. He was caught in the middle of the most powerful earthquake in the United States history. Across Alaska, the ground shattered like glass. Buildings fell to pieces. Icy cliffsides crashed into the sea. Giant tsunami waves smashed into towns and villages along the coast. Just moments before it started, Jackson had been at the waterfront in the small town of Valdez. The docks were crowded with families and happy kids. Suddenly, a strange roar filled the air. Jackson's body shook. But wait, it wasn't just his body that was shaking. Everything around him was shaking too. And then a woman screamed, "Earthquake!" The roaring got louder, hammering Jackson's ears. The ground shook harder, knocking him down to his knees. The freezing water in the harbor seemed to boil like an evil witch's brew. On the streets, cars swerved and spun. Trees and telephone poles swayed. The roaring got louder. The shaking got harder. Louder, harder, louder, harder. Jackson tried to stand up, but it was impossible. The ground seemed to have come alive, rising and falling and twisting and rolling. For Jackson, it was like riding on top of a giant squirming snake. He clawed his way forward on his hands and knees, inching his way across the shaking ground. He had finally made it out to the street when, crack! A massive gash opened in the ground right in front of him. Jackson turned around, but crack! An even bigger gash tore open behind him. A sickening stench rose from the darkness below. Jackson tried not to think of what could be waiting for him down there. Boiling lava? Shooting flames? The slobbering mouth of a hungry beast? The ground under him started to crumble apart. "Please, please, no!" Jackson screamed. But down he fell, helpless and terrified, into the darkness. Chapter 2. 3 weeks earlier, Monday, March 9th, 1964, 4:30 in the afternoon, 120 miles from Valdez, deep in the wilderness. "I don't think we'll be having fish for dinner tonight," Mom said, flicking a small icicle from her eyelash. Jackson peered down into the hole he and Dad had chopped through the ice. Jackson peered down into the hole he and Dad had chopped through the thick river ice. They'd been fishing for hours. So far, not even a nibble. Needles of cold jabbed at Jackson's toes. It wasn't too cold today, around 5 degrees. But he still should have worn a third pair of socks. Jackson stared down into the dark water. "I know you're down there, fish!" Dad chuckled, and Mom let out one of her famous barking laughs. She sounded like a seal. A very jolly seal, Dad always said. It was that laugh that had caught Dad's attention all those years ago when he and Mom were in college in Ohio. Back then, Dad was already dreaming of living on his own in the Alaskan bush. That's what people called the wild parts of Alaska, that were far from roads and towns. It turned out Mom was ready for an adventure, too. They came up here after college, found a patch of land near the river, and started building the cabin. What a disaster! Eyeing his parents, Jackson thought of all the horror stories they had told him about their first year in the bush. They ran out of food halfway through the winter. They got lost in the forest and nearly froze. Mom ate a poisonous mushroom and puked her guts out for a whole week. Finally, it was summer, and they were practically eaten alive by swarms of bloodthirsty Alaska mosquitoes. We were idiots, Mom liked to say. We had no idea what we were doing. We almost died 10 times, Dad would add, shaking his head. But each mistake taught Mom and Dad something new. And when they weren't hungry or freezing or being devoured by bloodsuckers, they were falling more and more in love with each other and with the wild land around them. Jackson was born 2 years later. He'd spent his whole life in the tiny cabin Mom and Dad had built about 2 miles from the river. Lucky me, Jackson thought, smiling to himself and giving his freezing toes a wiggle. So, what should we have for dinner? Dad asked. How about moose stew? Mom said. Or we could have moose burgers or moose meatloaf or moose meatballs. Or moose chili? Jackson asked. Oh, that would hit the spot, Dad said. Moose chili it is, Mom said. By this time of year, they were all sick to death of moose meat. It was their main food in the winter. Most other animals they could eat were hiding underground or hibernating during the coldest months. One male moose had 600 pounds of meat. They'd hunt one down, butcher the animal, cut up the meat, and preserve it in jars that they sealed shut in boiling water. By now, Jackson had eaten so much moose meat, he was surprised that he didn't have antlers. But he never complained. 3 years ago, they couldn't find a moose before winter blasted in. They barely had any meat all winter. Luckily, they had their winter supply of rice and beans and noodles. But they had to be careful, because if they ran out, they couldn't just drive to a store. They had no car. There were no roads in the bush. The nearest store was in a town about 20 miles away. No, living here wasn't always easy. Their cabin had no electricity or running water. Their toilet was a hole in the ground. The forest was filled with grizzlies and wolves. A person had to be tough to live in the bush. Alaska tough. Jackson looked around now, shivering a little. His toes were numb, but he smiled to himself as he looked up the river. It curled like an icy blue ribbon through the thick green forest. He'd always felt lucky to live in such an amazing place. Mom led the way on the 2-mile journey back home. The sun was starting to go down when the cabin finally came into sight. It was small and plain, just 4 walls made of logs, with moss stuffed into the cracks to keep out the cold. They were a few steps from the front porch when Mom stopped short. What's wrong? Dad asked. Mom pointed at something in the snow. Huge paw prints, scattered all around them. Jackson's stomach clenched as Dad slid his rifle off his shoulder. Only one animal left to track like that. A grizzly. Chapter 3. Jackson dropped to his knees and studied one of the paw prints. It was massive, bigger than his own 2 hands put together. The toes were spread out about an inch apart. Above each toe print was a dot. Those were where the tips of the bear's slashing claws dug deep into the snow. Grizzly for sure. Jackson had learned to read animal tracks before he had even learned his ABCs. This makes no sense, Jackson said, standing up. How could a grizzly be here? At this time in March, bears were supposed to still be hibernating. During the fall, they gorged themselves on roots and fish and whatever food they could find. Then they curled up in hollow trees or beneath rocky ledges and went into a kind of sleep. They stayed hidden away until at least late April. That was one good thing about winter in Alaska, not worrying about grizzlies. "It's a winter bear," Mom said in a low voice. The two words, winter, bear, turned Jackson's blood to ice. It was what they called a grizzly that came out of hibernation before it was supposed to. Winter bears were rare, and Jackson had never seen one with his own eyes. But he had heard terrifying stories about bears that crawled out of their dens way too early, desperately hungry. But where would a bear find food in the winter? Fish were sealed away under the thick ice. Small animals were tunneled into winter dens, deep below the frozen ground. Berry bushes were rare. That's why winter bears found their way to cabins, to humans. It was rare for a grizzly bear to attack a person, but winter bears were different. They could eat anything or anyone they could find. "Stay close together now," Mom said. Dad clutched his rifle. He'd never shoot an animal unless he had good reason. Jackson hoped this wasn't one of those times. Jackson narrowed his eyes, searching for the bear in the gathering darkness. He saw a pile of scat, grizzly poop, and more huge paw prints. But he couldn't see the bear anywhere. "Could it be gone?" Mom asked. Jackson's hopes rose. But then came a loud crash from inside the cabin. Jackson's heart stopped. The winter bear! That beast was in their home! "We have to stop it!" Mom cried, lunging forward. "Deb!" Dad barked, grabbing Mom's arm. "You know that's too dangerous!" "But Bruce, all of our food!" The jars that filled their kitchen shelves, the preserved moose meat, jams, berries, the can of salmon that they were saving for Dad's birthday next month, bags and boxes of rice and beans and noodles. The grizzly would knock all those jars onto the floor, shattering the glass. It would slash through the bags and boxes, bite through the cans. The bear would eat all that it could. What it left behind would be filthy and ruined. Jackson took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but then he heard other sounds. Crackle, pop. Jackson's eyes widened as smoke started seeping from under the front door of the cabin. "Fire!" Jackson shouted. Dad whispered a curse. "The bear must have knocked over the stove." Their heavy metal stove, which kept them warm where Mom cooked their food. They always tamped down the fire before they left the cabin, but a grizzly could have knocked it over, scattering glowing embers, bits of wood that could ignite a fire. Whoosh! Jackson leaped back as flames shot through the cabin roof. The darkening sky glowed blood red, and showers of sparks filled the air. Panic shot through Jackson's body, but there was still nothing he or anyone could do. There was no fire department here, no neighbors to rush over with buckets and hoses. Suddenly, the cabin door burst open. The grizzly staggered through a curtain of smoke. The bear was small and thin. One of its pointed ears was ragged and torn. It looked at them and then let out a weak, rasping cry. Dad aimed his rifle, but the bear vanished into the darkness. Jackson started ahead as the cabin crumbled away inside the orange, twisting flames. Everything he and Mom and Dad owned was inside. Not just the food, but clothes, Jackson's homeschooling books and supplies, and quilts Mom had sewn, furniture Jackson had helped Dad build. Soon it would all be gone. And what about Mom, Dad, and Jackson? What would happen to them? How would they even make it through this freezing night? Chapter 4. Jackson fought tears and tried to steady his heart. It was beating so hard he could hear it pounding in his ears. Boom, boom, boom. Mom must have heard it too. "Hey," she said, gripping his shoulders. "We're gonna be all right." Jackson wanted to believe Mom, but how could they be all right? Without their cabin, they'd freeze. Without their food, they'd starve. And what if the winter bear came back? Jackson stared at the burning cabin as if the answer might appear through the flames and smoke. "You know what we have to do," Mom said in a low voice. "We have to get to work." Get to work. That was a Barrett family saying, almost like a prayer. It was what they said when something had happened, when all you wanted to do was curl up in a ball and give up. It meant, get a grip on yourself, stop whining, get busy staying alive. Like that day last winter when Jackson was out rabbit hunting on his own. He'd been about a mile from the cabin when suddenly the sky got dark. Gray clouds cracked open. Snow poured down in thick sheets. Jackson couldn't see 2 inches ahead of him. There was no way he'd make it home. Jackson was so scared he couldn't even think straight. He'd run through the streets, slipped, and then bam! Down he went hard onto his back. He'd struggled to his feet and then stomped around blindly until he tripped again. Bam! This time he fell flat onto his face. He bit his tongue so hard that his mouth filled with blood. He lay there at the snow pouring down. "I'm done," he thought. Dad once told Jackson that there were 1,000 ways to die in Alaska. He'd meant it as kind of a joke. There definitely weren't 1,000, probably more like 50. And freezing to death in a blizzard had to be in the top 5. Blinded by snow, people roamed around in circles until they were too exhausted to take another step. Finally, they dropped to the ground and gave up. Their bodies disappeared under a blanket of snow until spring, when the wolves and the vultures found them and picked their bones clean. Jackson had imagined his own shining bones. "That's going to be me," he'd thought. And then a voice had whispered through his mind, "Get to work." And then louder, "Get to work." Suddenly his mind cleared. He stood up and slipped off his beat-up army backpack, which was packed with emergency supplies, a compass and a flashlight in case he got lost, emergency matches for building a fire, moose jerky and dried blueberries for energy, a whistle to scare away threatening animals, a rope to lower himself down from cliffs, and a shovel in case he ever got caught in a blizzard. Jackson had used the shovel to dig himself a big hole under a spruce tree. When the hole was good and deep, he'd climbed inside. He tugged his parka hood over his head and pulled his knees to his chest. Huddled in his little snow cave, he'd stay surprisingly warm and dry. After 2 hours, the snow stopped. Jackson would never forget the looks on Mom's and Dad's faces when he walked through the cabin door. How quickly their worry turned to pride. That was the moment Jackson knew he was tough. Alaska tough. And right now, as the hissing fire destroyed their cabin, Jackson dug deep for that feeling again. Yes, it was freezing cold. Overnight, it would get even colder. The winter bear was still out there. That's why they couldn't waste any time standing around whimpering. Jackson took a deep breath and stood taller. "Okay," he said to Mom. "Let's get to work." Chapter 5. About 20 yards from the cabin were 2 big steel drums, each the size of a large garbage can. Dad used his knife to pry open the bear-proof lids. Inside was everything they needed to keep from freezing and starving to death. A sturdy tent, sleeping bags, flashlights, a first aid kit, a camping stove, and a pot to melt snow for water. Plus, there was enough moose jerky to feed them for a few days. Of course, Mom and Dad had made sure they were prepared. even for this. The sounds of fire filled the air. Sizzle, crackle, hiss. Boom! A window shattered. The thick smoke burned Jackson's nose. Falling embers sizzled as they brushed against his face. But Jackson ignored the sounds and the smells and the pinpricks of pain. He barely glanced at the fire's twisting flames. He kept his mind focused on the work of loading the supplies onto the sled. When everything was piled on top, they dragged it to a spot far from the cabin. That way they'd be safe from flying sparks and embers. And as they set up the tent, Mom and Dad worked out their plan. "We'll stay here tonight," Dad said, grabbing a tent pole. "At sunrise, we'll leave for Glenallen." That was the closest town, 20 miles away. In the summer, they'd take their canoe down the river and get there in a day. But it was winter, and the river was frozen, and they'd have to walk a 3-day journey, if they were lucky. Jackson tried not to imagine what would happen to them on such a long trek in the winter. They could get slammed by a blizzard. They could fall through the river ice. And that winter bear... But he understood why they couldn't just stay here and live in their tent. It was too cold. And just like that winter bear, they wouldn't be able to find enough food. The calendar said that the first day of spring was only a couple of weeks away. What a joke. Here in Alaska, the freezing weather could stick around for months after that. "We'll call Uncle Solly from the general store," Mom said, spreading out a tarp over the snowy ground. "He'll drive up to Glenallen to get us." Uncle Solly. Just hearing that name helped Jackson relax. Uncle Solly was Mom and Dad's best friend, and Jackson's too. He lived in Valdez, a busy town on the sea about 100 miles south of Glenallen. Jackson, Mom, and Dad stayed in Valdez with Uncle Solly every summer. Those 3-week trips were a chance to take a short break from the wilderness. They'd stock up on food for the winter, see the doctor and the dentist, and go on adventures with Uncle Solly. Uncle Solly lived in a small cottage not far from the busy Valdez waterfront. Jackson felt like a prince as he took hot showers and used the toilet, which was inside the house. And the store-bought food: milk, eggs, chips, cookies, ice cream. Jackson stuffed himself at every meal. But 3 weeks in Valdez was always enough for Jackson. The noise, the cars, the people, it was all too much. He never liked saying goodbye to Uncle Solly, but he couldn't wait to get back home to the quiet of the bush. "How long will we stay in Valdez?" Jackson asked as he pounded a tent pole into the frozen ground. "Dad and I will have to get jobs," Mom said. We're going to need to save up money to buy supplies Dad and I will have to get jobs," Mom said. "We're going to need to save up money to buy supplies to rebuild." "Maybe we can get back here by August," Dad said. 4 months. Already, that seemed like forever. Chapter 6. 4 days later, Friday, March 13th, 1964, 4:45 a.m., Valdez, Alaska. The winter bear was in the cabin, and now it had come for Jackson, and there was no escape. Jackson stared in horror at the bear's dripping teeth, smelled its bloody breath. He braced himself for the bone-crunching bite, and then Jackson's eyes snapped open. It took a few seconds for his groggy head to clear. There was no bear. He wasn't in the cabin. He and Mom and Dad had made it to Valdez last night. They had gone to sleep in Uncle Solly's attic guest room. Jackson could hear Mom and Dad breathing softly from their bed a few feet away. In the moonlight, he could see the clock on the dresser, 4:45 a.m. Jackson pulled the quilt around him. He shivered as he remembered the 3 bitterly cold nights he had spent in their tent. His bones and muscles ached from the 20-mile walk. But they had been lucky. No blizzards, no sign of the winter bear. They had made it to Glen Allen with no trouble. The owners of the general store made them bowls of chili while they waited for Uncle Solly. By sunset last night, they were finally here, safe and sound. Jackson eyed the clock again. Should he get out of bed now? Back home, Jackson was always up at 5 o'clock. That way he could do some of his homework before chores. But his school supplies and books were all burned up now. It felt so good to be warm. Just a few more minutes, Jackson thought, closing his eyes. The next time Jackson woke up, the sun was streaming through the window. Mom and Dad's bed was empty. He looked at the clock. What? 8 o'clock? He had never slept that late in his life. One night in Valdez, and already he had turned into a lazy slug. He scrambled out of bed and threw on his clothes. They stank of smoke and sweat and moose jerky. In a flash, he was down the stairs. "Good morning," Uncle Solly boomed when Jackson walked into the cozy kitchen. He was at the stove. Mom and Dad were sipping coffee at the table. Jackson was glad to see his parents looking cheerful and bright-eyed. They'd all been dragging last night when they finally got to Valdez. "Sorry I slept so late," Jackson said. "I could have slept all day," Mom said with a yawn. "Be glad you weren't up early," Uncle Solly said to Jackson. "You escaped helping me shovel the driveway. It snowed last night. Again." Jackson looked out the window. Whoa! There was at least a foot of fresh snow on top of the 5 feet that had been there last night. Drifts rose up past the first-floor window of the house next door. "Did you know we get more snow here in Valdez than anywhere else in Alaska?" Uncle Solly said as he cracked an egg into the sizzling skillet. Dad and Mom smirked at Jackson over their mugs of coffee. Uncle Solly loved reminding them that Valdez was extra special. "Most beautiful town in Alaska," he would brag. "Everyone agrees." Out the window, Jackson could see straight down the street to the waterfront. Fishing boats bobbed in the bright blue water. Across the harbor, a zigzag of sparkling mountains rose into the morning sky. It was pretty, Jackson thought, but he missed the pine trees that surrounded the cabin. Uncle Solly put a heaping plate of fluffy eggs, thick bacon, and toast in front of Jackson. "Now that is beautiful," Jackson thought. They never got to eat eggs at the cabin, and Uncle Solly's toast was made with the squishy white store-bought bread that Jackson loved. "Thanks, Uncle Solly," Jackson said as he shoveled the first forkful into his mouth. "You won't believe it," Mom said, sitting back in her chair. "Dad and I already have jobs." "How did that happen?" Jackson asked through a mouthful. "Uncle Solly hired us," Dad said. Uncle Solly turned from the stove, his smile bright under his big, bushy mustache. He was a carpenter, and it turned out that he needed help with a new house he was building. "I'm lucky you showed up," he said. "We're the lucky ones," Mom said, smiling at Uncle Solly. "You've always been there for us." That was true. Mom and Dad had met Uncle Solly during their miserable first year in Alaska. He was living in the bush back then, in a cabin about 6 miles from theirs. When Mom and Dad ran out of food that winter, Uncle Solly shared his. He'd taught them about hunting and fishing and living off the land. Without Uncle Solly's help, Mom and Dad always said they wouldn't have survived that winter. "Uncle Solly," Jackson said, swallowing his last bite of eggs, "I'll help with that house too." It was the least he could do to show his thanks to Uncle Solly. Plus, he needed more practice if he was going to help Mom and Dad rebuild the cabin. "Jackson," Mom said, "you're not going to have time to work. You'll be in school." I can get my schoolwork done early in the morning, Jackson said, mopping up the last of his eggs with a crust of toast. He and Mom had always managed to squeeze in 3 or 4 hours of school into their busy days. We can't homeschool from here, Mom said. I'm going to be working too much. Dad and I are going to sign you up at the elementary school down the street. You'll start Monday. Jackson dropped his toast. I can't do that, he said. He had never set foot inside an actual school, but he knew what it would be like. A grumpy grandma type as a teacher, lessons so boring that he'd fall asleep. 6 hours a day stuck at a desk. Jackson was used to spending his days outside, always on the move. Going to school would be like going to jail. Come on, Dad said with a frown. Millions of kids go to school every day. It's only for a couple of months, Mom said. You'll make some friends. Jackson didn't need friends, thank you. He'd always gotten by on his own. And besides, what did he have in common with stuck-up town kids? He opened his mouth to explain all this, but then he shut it again. Mom and Dad had made up their minds, and Jackson wasn't a whiner. He had made it through a blizzard. He trudged 20 miles in the freezing cold. He was pretty sure he was tough enough for 5th grade. Chapter 7. 3 days later, Monday, March 16th, 1964, around 8 a.m., Valdez Elementary School. Welcome, Jackson. I'm Miss Lawrence. Please come in. Jackson stood in the doorway of the classroom and tried to hide his surprise. This teacher was no grumpy grandma type. She was young and tall, with long black hair and a bright smile. Jackson scanned the classroom. It was sunny, with colorful maps and posters on the walls. About 20 kids sat at desks lined up in rows. The boys all had short hair and were dressed in neat shirts and pants. Jackson glanced at his rumpled second-hand flannel shirt Mom had found yesterday in a church-used clothes bin. He patted down his overgrown curls. Maybe he should have cut his hair. Too late now. Class, this is Jackson, Miss Lawrence said brightly. Hello, Jackson, the class all said together. Jackson's stomach started to churn, and the pancakes and the 2 glasses of milk from breakfast sloshed around in his stomach. Was he going to puke all over the floor? He had never been to school before, but he was pretty sure that puking was the worst thing that could happen to a kid. He took a breath. Get a grip. Miss Lawrence led him to the closet where he could hang his coat and leave his lunchbox. He took off his beat-up army backpack, still filled with his emergency supplies. No, he probably didn't need them here in Valdez, but you never knew. Miss Lawrence pointed out an empty desk in the middle of the room. As Jackson sat down, a girl with short brown hair and cat-eye glasses leaned over and smiled. I'm Lenore. I'm Chris, said a short but muscular boy with fox-colored hair. I'm Nora, whispered a smiling girl with long yellow braids. I'm Mary, said the rosy-cheeked girl next to her. The other kids looked at Jackson and waved. None of them seemed stuck up, as far as Jackson could tell. Jackson, Miss Lawrence said, you're just in time for our morning geography lesson. Is everyone ready? Yes, Miss Lawrence, everyone sang. She stood in front of a big map of Alaska that hung in the front of the room. Jackson's stomach settled. Finally, the kids weren't all staring at him. Alaska's capital is, Miss Lawrence said. Juneau, chanted the class. Biggest city? Anchorage. When did Alaska become a state? 1959. When did people first come to Alaska? It was quiet for a few seconds. A few kids tried. In the 1800s during the gold rush? Miss Lawrence shook her head. 1700s? Russian explorers? No, Miss Lawrence said. During the Ice Age, Nora called out. Miss Lawrence smiled. Yes. Wow, Jackson thought. That was a long time ago. No one knows exactly when the first people came to Alaska, Miss Lawrence said, but it was definitely more than 10,000 years ago. And some of those people were my ancestors. As you all know, I am Unagax. That's one of the main Alaskan native cultural groups, Jackson thought, thinking back to the books that he and Mom had read about Alaska. There are many groups. Inupiaq, St. Lawrence Island Yupiks, Kupiks, Athabascans, Chimchians, Tlingit, Haida, and Supiaq. All of them different. They all have different languages and customs and different myths and arts. Hey, Miss Lawrence, Chris said with a sneaky grin. You don't look 10,000 years old. Kids giggled and Miss Lawrence let out a big laugh, almost as loud as Mom's. I was not born during the Ice Age, thank you, she said. Where did your ancestors come from, Miss Lawrence? Lenore asked. Miss Lawrence pointed to a big piece of land across the sea from Alaska. They came from here, she said. Today, it's called Siberia. She went on to explain that the sea between Siberia and Alaska was called the Bering Sea. But back during the Ice Age, the land and the oceans around the world looked very different. Part of the Bering Sea was dry land, so people could walk across to Alaska. Staring at the map, Jackson tried to imagine what a hard journey that must have been, and what was Alaska like during the Ice Age, even colder and icier than today. There were fewer trees to cut down and burn to stay warm, and even scarier animals, like saber-toothed tigers, giant wolves, and bears twice as big as today's grizzlies. Jackson shuddered. Jackson, Miss Lawrence said, jolting Jackson out of his thoughts. Where were you living before you came to Valdez? How should he know how to answer that? About 20 miles from Glenallen, he said. Come up and show us on the map, Miss Lawrence said with a wave. Jackson stood up. With every step towards the map, his beat-up work boots squeaked on the tiles. He pushed his curls out of his eyes so he could find Glenallen on the map. Then he pointed to a spot nearby where the blue line of the Copper River curved north. Miss Lawrence stared. How exciting! You were living in the bush! Jackson nodded. Wow! Someone shouted. Jackson thought it might be Chris. For how long? Miss Lawrence asked. My whole life, Jackson said. But our cabin burned down a week ago, so that's why we're here. The ferocious winter bear from his nightmare flashed into Jackson's mind. His stomach twisted. This time, he really was going to puke, for sure. Be right back, Jackson muttered, and then he bolted for the classroom door. Chapter 8. Jackson ran down the halls. He had seen the boys' room on his walk to the classroom, but now he couldn't find it. After 3 wrong turns, he finally made it. He pushed his way into a stall and stood there. His heart pounded. Sweat dripped down his back, but the queasy feeling passed. A minute later, the outside door creaked open. Jackson? Miss Lawrence. Jackson stepped out of the stall. Miss Lawrence was right outside the boys' room, with the door open just a crack. Do you need to see the nurse? She asked. Nurse? Last winter, Jackson nearly cut his finger off chopping wood. The blood soaked his shirt. Mom sewed up the deep cut with a needle and thread. Jackson bit down on a stick so he wouldn't yell out in pain with every stab of the needle. Jackson didn't need a nurse for a queasy stomach. No, thank you, he said. Miss Lawrence put her hand on his shoulder as they walked back to the classroom. You'll feel better, she said. First days are hard. Thanks, Jackson said, breaking away. He knew Miss Lawrence was trying to be nice, but she didn't understand. He wasn't some spoiled town kid. He'd grown up in the bush. The rest of the morning went okay. Luckily, kids didn't make a big deal about him rushing out of the room. Lenore leaned over and quietly asked him if he was okay, but that was it. It turned out Jackson was way ahead of most kids in math. He whipped through his long division problems. In grammar, they worked on commas, which Mom had taught him about last year. And the work wasn't boring. Miss Lawrence cracked jokes and even made stuff interesting. Jackson didn't fall asleep once. Plus, they had music class. Jackson didn't know any of the songs, but he liked listening to the other kids sing. When it was time for lunch, the kids all took their lunch boxes to the cafeteria. The noise in there was louder than a thunderstorm in the bush. The giggles and shrieks of the kids, the shouts of the frazzled-looking teacher trying to get the little kids to stop throwing food, the banging of chairs and slamming of metal lunchboxes. And Jackson had barely bitten into his bologna and cheese sandwich when kids started asking him questions about the bush. What did you eat? Where did you sleep? Did you have electricity? How did you take a shower? Jackson answered as best he could. The kids were especially amazed to hear how he had to lug water from the creek just to wash dishes or to take a bath. It sounds really fun, Lenore said, like a camping trip. Sure, Jackson thought. That's what Mom and Dad had thought when they first got to the bush. Then they almost died 10 times. But no reason to tell those kids any of that. I don't know, Nora said, nibbling on a chip. I couldn't live without electricity. I'd miss listening to music, Mary said. In music class, Jackson had noticed that Mary had the best singing voice. I'd miss my Twinkies, Chris added, picking up one of the vanilla cakes and giving it a kiss. The kids all laughed, even Jackson. What's the most amazing thing you've ever seen? Lenore asked, leaning forward. Jackson felt all their eyes on him, but surprisingly, he didn't get queasy like before. He thought about some of his favorite moments in the bush. A huge rainbow he saw after a big storm last summer. The sound of thousands of birds starting to sing at once right before a springtime sunrise. The time he saw an eagle snatch a huge salmon from the river with its pointy talon toes. To Jackson, every day in the bush was amazing. But he was pretty sure these town kids didn't want to hear about sunsets and birds. They wanted blood, guts, and snarls. Jackson had the perfect story. Chapter 9. I had spent the day fishing, Jackson said, wishing he could take all those kids back to that day. It was last June. The birds had come back from their winter getaways. Moose calves, fox kits, bear cubs, and baby rabbits were scampering around the forest with their mothers. On the way back to the cabin, I climbed up onto a high ridge that overlooked the valley. That view popped into Jackson's mind. The endless green forest, the bright sparkle of the river, how the snow-topped mountains looked as if they were wearing diamond crowns. When I got to the top, I looked down, and right below me, maybe 15 feet down, was a pack of wolves. The kids all gasped. A whole pack? Mary said. I'd pee my pants if I saw a wolf pack, Chris said. Lenore elbowed him. That's gross. Sorry, said Chris. It's true. Jackson understood why most people would be scared. Wolves were fierce predators, fast and tough, with jaws strong enough to bite through bones. But Jackson shook his head. Wolves don't usually bother with humans, Jackson explained. At least not in the summer, when there was plenty of food. Plus, I was up on those rocks. They couldn't get up there, and there was a strong wind blowing towards me. I could smell the wolves, but they couldn't pick up my scent. Jackson could see the wolves so clearly, the pups scampering about, tackling one another, rolling in the mud like furry little wrestlers. The grown-ups lounged in the sun like they didn't have a worry in the world. And then out of nowhere, this huge grizzly came crashing out of the woods. Yikes! Chris yelped. For a second, Jackson wondered if he should stop. Was this too scary for them? Go on, Nora said, and the others nodded. Guess not. The bear was massive, Jackson said. I'd say it had to weigh 1,000 pounds. He remembered how the bear's muscles had rippled under its fur. Grizzlies are way bigger and stronger than wolves, Jackson pointed out. One swipe of a grizzly's paw can crack a skull or slice open a wolf's belly. That's gotta hurt, Chris said with a wince. Poor wolves, Mary cried. But here's the thing, Jackson said, lowering his voice. It surprised him that the kids were so interested. Wolves don't fight alone. They fight as a pack. They stick together. He described how the grizzly went after one wolf and how the other wolves came up behind the bear. They growled and snarled and snapped at the bear's legs. They stood their ground, protecting one another. Did it work? Nora asked. Jackson nodded. The grizzly gave up eventually. It ran into the woods. The wolves win! Chris cried, raising his arms. All the kids smiled. That was really an amazing story, Jackson, Lenore said. Better than a movie, Mary agreed. Jackson sat back and took a deep breath. He was glad the kids liked his story, but he'd never talked so much in one day in his entire life. He could use some peace and quiet. Except at recess, the kids wanted to play hide and seek. Chris is it! Nora shouted. Jackson played for a while, but as the kids were scattered around, hiding behind piles of snow, Jackson realized that this was his chance to steal some time for himself. He hurried all the way around the back of the school, far from the playground. He squeezed himself behind a shed and sat down. Finally, some peace. You're a good hider, Lenore said when the bell rang and Jackson finally came out of his spot. The rest of the afternoon crept along. By 3 o'clock, Jackson's head was pounding. He couldn't wait to get home. But as he was putting on his parka, Chris came up to him. Jackson, he said as he was zipping up, want to come with us to Lenore's? She has the new Beatles, Nora said. The new Beatles? Jackson asked, picturing shiny bugs inside a box. That made no sense. Lenore must have noticed, and he was confused. They're a band, she said. The Beatles. How could he know that? And what a dumb name for a band. Wait until you hear their songs, Mary said. You'll love them. And Lenore has a hula hoop, Nora said. Hula hoop? What in the world was that? Back in the bush, Jackson could name any bird by listening to its song. He knew every flower by its smell. He could find his way home by looking at the sun or the stars. But standing here, Jackson felt completely lost. His stomach started churning again. Come on, Nora said. It'll be fun. Lenore has some new silly putty. Silly what? He had to get out of here, now. Thanks, Jackson said, hurrying down the hallway. But I need to get back home. He rushed out of the classroom and down the hall. He pushed through the heavy front door of the school, sucking in the cold, fresh air. Free! He had made it through his first day. He tried not to think of how he would make it through the rest. Chapter 10. 10 days later, Thursday, March 26th, 1964. By the end of the second week, Jackson had school figured out. He could remember all the words to the Pledge of Allegiance. He'd learn every verse of My Country, 'Tis of Thee, which they sang together after the pledge. He could get to the boys' room with his eyes closed. As for the kids, Jackson had decided it was easier to just stay away. Half the time, he didn't understand what they were talking about. He'd stand there feeling all confused, like a moose calf lost in the woods. What was the point of even trying to figure out what a hula hoop was, or why this Beatle band was so great? Soon he'd be back in the bush, where he belonged. None of that stuff would matter. He'd never see these kids again. At lunchtime, he skipped the cafeteria and slipped right out to the playground. He'd pick out a quiet spot behind a giant pile of snow. That way he could eat his sandwich in peace. He avoided the recess games of hide and seek. When Lenore would invite him over after school, Jackson would make up an excuse. Same with Mary's ice skating party and sledding at Nora's. Finally, kids stopped asking him to do things. They didn't try to include him in their talks about bands or toys or games. They didn't ask him to tell any more exciting stories about the bush. These past few days, nobody at school talked to Jackson much at all, except for Miss Lawrence. Which is what Jackson wanted, right? That Thursday morning, the class was buzzing with excitement. Easter weekend was coming up. The school was closed for tomorrow for the Good Friday holiday. All morning, kids chattered about their holiday plans. There were family dinners, an Easter egg hunt, a basketball game at the high school, ice skating at the pond. But what the kids were most excited about was a big supply ship that would be docking in Valdez tomorrow. It was called the Chena, and it was coming from Seattle. Jackson had already heard about it from Uncle Solly. His close buddy was a member of the crew. Uncle Solly was hoping to see him while the ship was docked. "Half the town will be there to watch Chena unload," Uncle Solly had said. "Everyone is waiting for something that's on that ship." Stores in town were running low on food and other things, Uncle Solly had explained. Fresh fruits and vegetables, toilet paper, batteries, parts for cars. Just yesterday, Jackson had heard Chris complaining that the market was out of Twinkies. "I'm going to starve," he moaned. Pretty much everything people bought at stores in Alaska came from the lower 48. That's what people in Alaska called the other parts of the United States. Everywhere but Alaska and Hawaii. Alaska had lots of trees and animals and fish, but not many farms or factories. Even Mom and Dad and Jackson needed to buy things, like their parkas and boots and kerosene for their lamps and fishing gear and wood stove. And of course, the extra food they needed for the winter: rice, noodles, oatmeal, and beans. They wouldn't be able to live in the bush without all that stuff. Thinking about all this, Jackson eyed Miss Lawrence as she wrote out long division problems on the blackboard. He tried to picture her ancestors trudging across that icy bridge. There were no stores or ships back then. People had to get everything from the land. Every bite of food, every scrap of clothing. They invented new ways to hunt and fish. They figured out how to build warm houses and fast boats from caribou hide or the bark of trees. They'd found ways to live, to have families, to stay in Alaska for all those centuries. Talk about Alaska tough, Jackson thought. At recess that day, Jackson had found a new pile of snow where he could sit on his own. He'd just finished his sandwich when he heard the kids talking nearby. He recognized some of the voices: Nora, Mary, Lenore, and Chris. They couldn't see him, but he could hear what they were talking about. "The Chena is the best ship," a boy was saying. "Last year I got 3 lollipops," said Mary. "I got chocolate," said another girl. "I got an orange," Nora said proudly. An orange? Jackson had never seen even one of those. He listened as Nora told how she brought it home and saved it for days. "What did it taste like?" someone asked her. "Like sunshine," she said. Jackson smiled a little as he tried to imagine what sunshine might taste like. Nora always knew how to describe things, Jackson had noticed. The kids bickered over when it would be best to meet at the waterfront. In the end, they decided on 5 o'clock. "Should we invite Jackson?" Lenore asked. Jackson's ears perked up. Maybe this was one time he'd say yes. He'd like to get his hands on a real orange. "He won't come," Mary said. "Don't even bother asking him," Nora said. "Yeah," Chris nodded. "He hates us." Jackson blinked, as if he'd been slapped. "That kid's weird," said another boy. "What's with that backpack? Who carries an army backpack to school?" Jackson stared at his backpack. "Don't be mean," Lenore said. "Maybe he'd like us if we had fur and tails," Chris said. A couple of kids snickered. Jackson's cheeks burned, like he was sitting too close to a fire. The bell rang. Jackson heard the kids' crunching footsteps as they hurried back towards the school. He had to stop himself from chasing after them. "I don't hate you," he wanted to shout. But it was too late for that, because now they all hated him.